guys, to walk you through my sermon here. I just want to be right honest. It is weird to me to just speak to a camera. So we're just going to accept the fact that it's weird for me. I'm preaching to this camera. So I was one of those kids who would give my parents exactly what I wanted on a list for Christmas. On top of that, I would take, not pictures, because we didn't have cell phones back then, but I would go to toy stores and I would write down the exact thing I wanted. I would clip out pieces of the Sears catalog, that's how old I am, and the Canadian Tire catalog. I would be like so obsessed with exactly what I wanted because my toy dreams were so important to me. So one Christmas, I knew, for the most part, if my parents had behaved, I knew what I was going to get for Christmas. And I remember this one Christmas, coming downstairs, looking under the tree and realizing that the size of box that what I wanted came in was not there. And I remember being so upset. And so then my parents, we went through Christmas and I did that thing where you're kind of like, thank you, but I didn't really want this. I don't know if you've met that child, that was me. My dad ended up explaining to me that he went to get what I wanted. He couldn't get it anymore, so he actually paid for a demo display of something very similar. So what I had wanted was probably Star Wars minifigures. I know it's, even saying it out loud I feel silly, but it's just me and a camera. Well, what he got me was like 3 or 4 different battle sets of Star Wars with all these little minifigures, and I played with those forever. But I felt like that Christmas that all my dreams had died. Today we're talking about lament, and I want to clarify, lament, biblical lament, is not pain associated with failure like falling off a skateboard. Lament is not getting a failing grade on a test you didn't study for, or even failing a test you did study for. Lament is not even that horrible pain that comes after letting someone down. Lament is worse than all of that. The best way I can describe lament is that grinding, aching, wretched, deep down misery that arrives at the death of a dream. That's lament. All of us have felt this in varying ways, in varying levels. I've seen lament in the eyes of a junior high girl who was dumped by her high school boyfriend just before she arrived at youth group. Dreams died that day. She couldn't yet see hope for a brighter future. That's lament. Recently, some friends of mine canceled their wedding. They had planned this amazing destination wedding. They had all of this stuff figured out. They had people who were going to fly all over the world to get to this destination wedding, and then travel plans got broken. So then they decided they would do a gathering at their local church. Well, then the government restricted how many people could come to a local church. So then they decided that they would do their wedding a smaller, intimate gathering in Banff. So they locked that all up, and then restriction to Banff happened. So finally, they decided to do their wedding with less than 15 people standing 10 feet away from each other under a tree in their backyard. It was not the wedding that they wanted. They said their vows, they live streamed the ceremony, and they sealed it with a kiss. But dreams of the beautiful wedding died that day. That's lament. Now, even though they are hoping for a brighter future, lament came when they realized the wedding they wanted didn't happen. Now, there's a moment in Star Wars where Darth Vader uses a weapon called the Death Star to destroy a planet called Alderaan. Now, some of you are like, wow, this reference is really old. Yes, I am a Star Wars person. When the planet Alderaan died, they said there was a massive disturbance in the force, like millions of lives crying out and then silenced. That's what I felt when they ended school 4 months before grad. That's lament. Even though they are hoping for a brighter future, it doesn't erase the pain of dead dreams. That's lament. I'm going to look in the Bible right now to Genesis chapter 12. Now in Genesis chapter 12 we have the story of Abram, who eventually will go by the name of Abraham, so we're just going to call him Abraham. What I love in Genesis chapter 12 is that just prior to chapter 12, there's this reference to Terah, and Terah is Abraham's dad, and Terah for some reason decides to move his entire family to the land of Canaan, and yet he doesn't. For some reason he just stops. And I like to think that maybe Terah originally was called by God to do what Abraham did, but didn't. For some reason just stopped. But what I love about the story about Abraham, when God calls him, is that he does go. It says in Genesis chapter 12, verse 4, it says, "So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there." I don't know if you've ever moved, but I know that moving can be so hard and so frustrating. And I think that moving, as much as there's anticipation or there's hope for a brighter day, moving is also one of those lamenting moments. It's dreams of a future here have died. And I think for Abraham, when he chose to move, his dreams of living there with his family, like it was like God asked him to leave his home, his family, his religion, his entire way of life. And what I love about Abraham is he does it. So even though his dreams died that day, he was hoping for a bright future. And then he gets to Canaan, and within a few chapters, they say that there's an entire famine that strikes the land. And so then he has to move again. And his dreams died that day, but he was still hoping for a brighter future. And then things go good. They go so good that him and Lot have taken over most of the land, and the land can't feed their family and their livestock, so then they have to split. And I think probably when they had to split, there was probably another one of those lament things, because Abraham loved his nephew so much he brought him with him. And then there's this, we can't stay together, so they have to separate. That's a moment of lament. And then, as the story of Abraham goes on, he tries to solve some things with his own methods. Mistakes are made. Decisions go very badly. Ultimately, God asks for Abraham's son. I think, we like to look at this Abraham story like God calls him to give Isaac up, and he's just like, oh, okay, no problem. I don't think it was like that. I think it was horrible. I think the lament of God saying, I need you to kill your son, must have been horrible for him. Dreams died that day, and I don't think that Abraham could see a bright future on the way to the mountain to sacrifice his own child. And yet, he chose to obey, and through that obedience, through that process of wrestling with what it's like to follow God, God provided a solution. One of my favorite artists, Andrew Peterson, writes an entire song about the journey of Abraham and Isaac. And what I love about it, the refrain of this song is, "Holy is the Lord, and the Lord I will obey." But then he asks the question, how do I do this? And I don't know the way. In Psalms 137, we have this cry of lament. So years and years and years after Abraham, hundreds of years later, the nation of Israel had established themselves, and they had basically failed God in so many ways that he uses the nation of Babylon to destroy them, and they get taken into captivity. Right? So some serious lament happens when your entire nation is destroyed and you're taken into captivity. And so in Psalms 137, verse 1 says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and we wept and we remembered Zion." Now Zion is Israel. And what I love about that picture is that they're sitting and they're lamenting, they're crying, they're reminiscing about the dreams that had died. And they write, "There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy." When you think about that, their captors are saying, "Go ahead, sing us songs about your broken dreams." That's lament. And in verse 4 they write, "How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land?" When we are in a season of lament, that should be the cry. How can we sing songs of the Lord in a foreign land? How can I be excited about what God is doing? How can I passionately move forward when everything feels like it's falling apart? And dead dreams force us to question God. And that wrestling is where growth comes from. I like to think of this wrestling as God trying to get out of the boxes that we've put him in. See, the nation of Israel, which is our Christian heritage and origin, is a wrestler with God. If you grasp what I'm trying to say with this whole idea of box, when God gets out of the box, he shows us a brighter future. But it's that wrestling. The wrestling is where the growth comes from. Now in Mark chapter 16, there's this beautiful picture of Jesus' resurrection. So in Mark chapter 16, Jesus has been crucified. The disciples have kind of run away. And I think that the death of Jesus was the ultimate lament, because the disciples had a plan, they had a strategy. They kind of knew that Jesus was taking over. Their idea, their dream of a kingdom was happening. And then in a few hours on a Friday, everything broke. And they're wondering, what do we do next? But in Mark chapter 16, you have this story of Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome, who are bringing spices to Jesus' body. And they get there, and there's this angel sitting there, and he says, "Yeah, the guy you're looking for, he's not here. Go tell the disciples." And it says, later, Jesus appeared to the 11 as they were eating, and he rebuked them for their lack of faith and their stubborn refusal to believe those who had seen him after he had risen. I love that, because when you're in lament, when your dreams have died and you're wrestling with what's next, that's that moment where other people are seeing God work and you're in the middle of the wrestle and you can't see. And even the disciples who spent time with Jesus were still shocked, dismayed. They were horrified by what just happened. I wrote about the death of my dreams in my own book. So I'm just going to read. This is on page 146 of Broken Mortals, which I feel weird saying that, but it's my own book. I know what it is like to feel unworthy and disqualified. I remember struggling through classes in Bible college and wondering if I would ever graduate and be a youth pastor. I remember crying out to God at a worship event, desperately wanting to be used by Him, but feeling so far from the man I knew I was supposed to be. And then I talk in here about, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I talk about here about this kid who brings a weapon to my youth group. And I talk about how a normal, good youth pastor would have taken the weapon away, but instead it was pretty cool, and I wanted the kids to like me, so I didn't take it. And then later on, he actually got pretty badly hurt in a fight in our small town with that weapon. And later on, trying to patch it up, I just remember regretting. So in 2001, I accepted a call to the youth ministry of Beulah Alliance Church. I knew immediately that I was in over my head. It was almost triple the size of my former youth group. But the thing that no one saw in my life is the fact that while I was growing into my role as a youth pastor, I was struggling in my role as a husband. The move to Edmonton had provided a major strain on my relationship I was in complete denial of. I was doing what I loved and completely ignoring any signs of brokenness in my relationship with my wife. To make matters worse, we were also drowning in debt, partially because the house we bought in Melfort refused to sell, and mostly because I refused to take a serious look at our finances. In reality, I was not being a good steward of the money that had been given to me. And my lack of control in this area showed up in angry outbursts, ridiculous spending decisions, and compulsive behaviors that eroded my marriage further and further on a daily basis. I remember feeling that I had failed God, my church, and my family when after 5 years in Edmonton, our house in Melfort, Saskatchewan had not sold. Giving that house back to the bank completely destroyed me, put me on a path of self-destruction that would ultimately ruin my marriage. After a while, my wife only saw the angry Chet, the depressed Chet, and the blaming Chet. She no longer saw the man who wanted to change the world or the boy who loved youth ministry. The Chet that everyone else saw, who loved his job and his life and no longer walked through the door when he got home. My wife left when she could no longer live with the person I had become. I was overwhelmed and unable to forgive myself for the pain I had caused from my many terrible decisions. I worked for Beulah for 15 years, but in the end I walked away from ministry because I couldn't fix what I broke. So lament for me feels like dreams dying. So when my wife walked out, dreams died. When I walked away from ministry, dreams died. But I didn't start wrestling with God until I had to sell my house. That broke me, and that hurt. And it was literally the wrestling with God that saved me. It hurt, it was painful, but God had to do some work in my heart. And through that defeat, I began to see what God was trying to do in my heart. So lament for me feels like dreams dying. And dead dreams force us to question God. And that wrestling, that questioning of God is where growth comes from. So lament is a good thing because it forces us to question God. Wrestling with God is where growth comes from, and growth is necessary for us to move forward in our journey with God. So in your small groups, I would love for you to unpack those times of lament.